Hello, my name is Tom Spare. This is Spare Report, the podcast where I sit down to talk to people who are doing interesting work in important areas of society that are often underreported or misrepresented by the media. For today's episode, I talked to Dr. Samantha James, an NHS doctor who in 2022 volunteered for Sea-Watch, a charity that collects refugees who cross the Mediterranean to help them find safe harbour. I wanted to talk to Sam about why she became a doctor and how she found out about Sea-Watch. On this episode, we talk about the conditions on the ship and we talked through the collection of refugees in distress and how the team on board found safe port to dock. So let's spare a thought for the care of refugees.
I grew up all over the UK and a bit in Germany because my dad was military, so we moved around. But I've always sort of been in the southwest of England, really. Went to school in Yeovil and Bristol, and then family are living in this sort of Bath southwest region. Um, what drew me to being a medical professional? This feels like you're interviewing me for medical school again. But I don't know, it just sort of happened really. So I got into volunteering at a camp for disabled children via my sister, who was doing Duke of Edinburgh Gold. She'd want me to say, not just bronze, but gold. And so we sort of went along with her, both me and my other sister, so that my parents could have a week off. And that was, I think I was 13 maybe, and I just loved it. I just really loved being part of something that gave back, and it was really cool to see the change in the kids, having never been away from home because they were told they couldn't be away from home because of their disabilities. And then it was just awesome. And then happened to be academic, and then decided I wanted to do nursing, and then got told by my school that I couldn't apply for nursing, and was told to apply for medicine, which I did, and I'm glad I did. I think it suits me a little bit more being a doctor. Both my sisters are actually doctors, so we kind of have just been copying each other our whole lives, and that has continued.
How long have you been a qualified doctor for?
This is my 6th year.
And you did your training at Cardiff Uni, yeah?
Yeah, 6 years at Cardiff. Yeah, I think always did some kind of volunteering. From that first thing I did when I was 13, I always had something going on. And like at uni, there was, I can't remember what they called it now, but I went with a charity called Skillshare for 3 months to Lesotho, but Southern Africa, and did like a human rights advocacy program in schools there. And then just sort of got the bug for it and like to combine like my skills, and always thought, well, fine, when I'm actually a doctor, I will actually try and find somewhere where I can use my skills and come back. So yeah, it was sort of always the plan, but I never really knew how I was going to make it happen, and also make it sustainable, because I have a non-medical partner who doesn't want to be out of the UK. So it's trying to balance the two of those, which so far I've managed to do, but it can be tricky. But yeah, it was always my hope and dream really to get into global health, get into refugee medicine really.
How much did you know about the situation in the Mediterranean before you went out there?
I sort of did the reading on it. I knew that it was going to be quite a big undertaking, and I didn't want to just go in blind and not informed. So I sort of read all of the articles and newspapers and things that I could find about it, but it's such a changing picture that, you know, you can read it 1 month and then by the next month the EU law has changed and the rules have changed and everything's so different. So yeah, I probably didn't know much about it realistically when I went out there. So I did end up going a bit blind despite trying to read about it. It's just such a can of worms. Like there's so much context and so much, like you've got to know all the geopolitical stuff. Like everything is relevant. I don't understand it now, and I'm definitely not here as an expert. But I know more now than I did then.
So could you tell me a bit about the organisation you were working for and how you found out about the opportunity? Because you've already said that there was that interest there to do stuff related to with refugees, with health volunteering. So yeah, tell me about the organisation and how you found out about it.
So the organisation is called Sea-Watch, and it's a German NGO that was founded in 2014, maybe 15, by a group of like people with nautical experience. They weren't doctors, they weren't medical, who kind of recognised that there was an increasing need, and there were more and more deaths every year in the Mediterranean Sea. So they kind of got together, got a ship, did it up and just set sail and tried to be out there. And over time, it's really developed to quite a elaborate and huge operation. And I think there's currently 11 NGOs working out in the Mediterranean doing the same thing. And I heard about it when I was in Athens doing a different charity. So Medical Volunteers International is another NGO, also German, because the German do it so well. And I was working with them and had met someone who had said, "Oh, have you seen what's happened?" And I think on that day there'd been a particularly high death count. And so she'd shared with me that one of her friends had worked for Sea-Watch, sort of did a bit of reading, followed their socials, and thought, "Oh, I could do that." And it was about another year until I actually applied and went for it. But yeah, I heard from her, and then felt like that was the next natural step after getting my feet on the ground and working in refugee camps there. I thought, well, I've got that experience. Went back to the UK and kind of worked in A&E, did a bit more pediatrics, tried to kind of really hone the skills I felt like I would need on board the ship, and then applied for a mission and sort of waited for a date. They call it a mission. I'm not saying I'm James Bond, a project, whatever you want to call it. Sort of waited for a date to come up. And then I think in the end, they called me up a week before because one of the doctors was sick and then said, "Can you come?" And I was free. So I went, which was a bit
Wow.
earlier than I expected, but yeah, it worked out really well.
And how much? So you done that project in Greece. What was the
Mm.
sort of was the Greek project the first one you'd sort of done as a doctor, or were there other things that you'd done before that?
That was the first one that I'd done as a doctor. So with the training, you have to do 2 full-time years as a foundation doctor. And it was at the end of those 2 years that I kind of chose to be unemployed, so that I could have a bit more freedom. And then it was in that, I think, October. So I finished in August and then October went to Greece. And that was the first project that I'd done. And that was kind of my gateway in, really.
Hmm. Okay, yeah. And what's sort of the gap between that Greek experience and then going out to the Mediterranean?
So I think I got back from Greece in November time and then went to Sea-Watch, I think, in May the following year.
And what year was that?
So 2022 was when I was on the boat.
And how long did you do that for?
So the boat, the total time, I think it was 6 weeks.
6 weeks.
Six weeks total, yeah. And that includes a week at the start of training and a week of debriefing at the end. So the mission itself was 4 weeks long.
For that 4 week period, was it the same members of staff or was there like a rotation? How did that sort of?
Mm. So there were 24 members or volunteers on board. And that was comprised of, so from a medical point of view, there was 2 doctors and then 2 associate professionals. So one was what they call in Germany a little paramedic, which sounds patronizing, but it's basically someone that's done a short course. So they can do kind of basic dressings, some fluids. And then if you're a big paramedic, it means you've done like a few years of experience after that. So we had a little paramedic and then a nurse, and that was the medical team. And then the rest of the thing was made up of a captain, a first officer, a bosun, a few deckhands, a cook, a guest coordinator, and then a few supporting that team. So yeah, 24 in total. And so we'll refer to the people that were rescued as guests. That's just the language that we used. So before the guests were on board, we would work on the clock. So what do they call it? The ship clock, I think they called it. So it's a 24-hour clock, and you were assigned 4 hours in every 12-hour cycle. So I had the honor of being awake from midnight to 4 a.m. and then midday to 4 p.m. And it's during those 4 hours that I would be up on the top of the deck with the binoculars, searching the horizon, looking for boats, checking the alarm phone. And so, yeah, you kind of just carried on doing that in a 12-hour cycle. so that the deck was always covered and things like that. But at the time, it was Sea-Watch 3. So I think they're up to Sea-Watch 5 now. They've kind of upgraded the boat as the years have gone on. And that was an old fishing trawler boat that had been repurposed, essentially. So we had little cabins. So me and the other Dr. Heidi shared a cabin. So we were in bunk beds. And yeah, it was very, very small. I'm very, very tall, 6'1". It is quite a small bed, but yeah, it was nice. The first kind of couple of weeks was about getting to know each other and like learning to trust one another. And so we really did a lot of team bonding. So every day we'd have breakfast together, and then we'd clean the ship together, which the novelty never wore off, even after 6 weeks. I had so much fun kind of shining up all of the parts of the ship. And yeah, it was fine. I mean, the conditions that we had compared to what the guests had were very, very different, which always sort of bothered me, but I understand why it had to be like that. So we had beds and cabins, but when the guests came on board, they just had the deck, and we would give everyone a blanket and some water, and that's kind of all we were able to offer. So they would be exposed on the outside, and we were inside in cabins. So that always bothered me, but it was sort of necessary, really, because we were awake for kind of 22 hours a day by the end of it. So yeah, the conditions were absolutely fine. We were very lucky that we had a volunteer chef on board.
What sort of situation were the guests in, the refugees were in? I mean, was it variable sized crafts that were coming across? And did you have any interaction with other ships? What were the logistics around that?
No real interactions with other ships. So the middle of the Mediterranean Sea is just like horizon and horizon everywhere you look. It's not like there are big cargo ships or anything really passing by. So other than the difficult interactions with the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, we didn't come into contact with any other kind of cargo ships or anything like that. And the boats, yeah, they really did vary in size. And again, every mission has a different experience. So for us, we spent, I think it was 5 or 6 days with nothing. We couldn't see any boats. We couldn't get any signals on the alarm phone. And we got to a point where we thought maybe there wasn't going to be anyone during the time that we were out there. But the weather was really good, and we knew that there was going to be a good few days, which obviously is the determining factor for a lot of people is the weather reports. So we did all of our rescues in a 24-hour period, and we had 7 different rescues. I think the smallest boat that we had was 11 people, and the largest boat was 106. And these boats completely vary in what they're made of. So they can be fiberglass, wooden, rubber dinghies, like literally made of plastic. And yeah, they really, none of them are seaworthy. So the kind of rules is that we don't just rescue any boat that we see. We rescue any boat which looks unseaworthy if people are in distress. But by definition, all of these boats that the smugglers put them into are not seaworthy. They don't have food, water, shelter, enough petrol to get them to Europe. So they're sort of never going to get there without any help. So yeah, our rescues really varied in size, and the like composition of people also varied. So on some of the boats, you had a lot of women and some small children, and in other boats, it was just completely all young men. And it was just sort of determined where they were coming from. So most of them, I think, if not all of ours, came from Libya, and were sort of moving in groups with other people from the same country because they spoke the same language and things like that. So yeah, it was so variable. But then you speak to someone else who'd been on a next mission, and they might have had just one boat that had 50 people in it. It's just so variable what you can get, and that's part of the challenge is you can't really plan how many people you're going to have. And yeah, when it's time to rescue, it's time to rescue. So that 24-hour period, none of us slept because we've all got different places on the boat during the rescue, and you all have to be there. So you just finish doing one boat, you just going down for a nap, and then the walkie-talkies go off again, time to rescue, and then you're back up again. So it was a bit wild, that 24 hours. But yeah, crazy.
Wow. Okay. I just can't. These are 150 people
150, yeah.
on one. Wow, okay.
And they
And
are
what?
quite they're quite big wooden type boats.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
And did that have an engine, like, or what was that?
Yeah. So they had engines, and what was often the case is they had kind of jerry cans full of petrol that they
Right.
would put in the middle. And the idea would be that somebody or some people would, be filling up the engine and driving the boat. But what would often happen actually in the smaller boats, the rubber dinghies, is that the petrol would leak. Petrol and seawater is a really nasty combination, and it's mostly the women and the children that sit in the lower part of the boats, and so they would come on. And our first job when we saw that would be to literally smell them for petrol, because the salt from the sea and the petrol would cause horrendous skin burns.
Oh,
So the first, we just had to shower them off as soon as they came on board, and then wrap their legs in like cling film and try and prevent the burns from being too significant. So yeah, we usually, when we spot a boat, we get an indication of what type of boat it was and roughly the number of people, and then we could appropriately prepare for our triaging of them depending on what we thought we were going to find. But yeah.
you, what sort of capacity was there for the number of people that you could have on board? How many people could you sort of take at one time?
So the NGO answer would be leave no one behind. So there is no capacity.
Right,
Um, so we were full, like there were just people absolutely everywhere, sleeping like sardines.
right.
But previous missions have had even more people than we had. Um, and what we would then do is call on some of our other NGO colleagues to come and ferry them out and help us support with that. So we had 356 guests during our time, which is kind of upper limit of what our boat could handle. But we would never not
Yeah,
take people on board. Even if people stood up for 24 hours, that's what they would do,
yeah, yeah,
until there was a better solution,
yeah, yeah,
which has happened in the past. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Wow. Um, so then what happened to them after that? So you have that number of people on board, and then you go back to your what port were you going into? Where were you?
Yeah, so that what happened to us is different to what happens to them now. But
Yeah,
once we have the guests on board, the political games begin, and
yeah,
the standoff begins. So at that time, so they have changed the way they do it now, is we would be in international waters. We would have to then move into European waters, which geographically would usually be Italy. But Malta, Italy, Spain, and Greece are all the countries that are predominantly affected by this area. And then we will say to the EU, we have X number of children, X number of unaccompanied minors, women. These are the medical conditions we have. We need a port of safety. Then they'll say no. And then we'll go back to them and say, please. And then no. And that can continue. And I've had some colleagues that have been on the boat for 2 weeks, just floating around in European waters, waiting for a port of safety. And that's really frustrating. And that's what I found the hardest, was like just the most unbelievable thing that the countries wouldn't let them in. But it all goes back, and I'm not a lawyer. My husband's a lawyer. I am not. To the Dublin 3 regulations, so I'm told, which is all about whose responsibility it is for the asylum procedure. So if they first enter a European country, which is deemed a safe country, they have to seek asylum in that country. And therefore, Malta, Italy, Spain, Greece don't want that boat to come to their country, because suddenly they're responsible for 356 extra people. So they just do a lot of tactics, try and kind of just waste time, really. But inevitably, they always give a port of safety. But they don't just give us the nearest one. They'll say, okay, yeah, you can have this one, but it's going to take you 3 days to get to it, and it's the other side of Spain. And it's just one of their many tactics to try and delay you getting back out to the waters, really. And then when you get to the port, there's all of these kind of like regulations they put in. So various NGOs have been accused of human trafficking and drug smuggling, because we do carry controlled drugs on board, and we do, can't transport humans. And then they'll just kind of get really arbitrary things like, you've got too many life jackets on board, we're going to compound your ship for 2 weeks and you can't use it. So that's lots of the tactics that we see. And we can't just, so some people were like, oh, why don't you just go into whatever port? But there famously, I can't remember when it was or what her name is, but there was one captain of the ship who got kind of sick and tired of waiting and had a boat full of people that kind of needed medical assistance, needed food, needed to begin their asylum process. And so she just went into a port and docked up, and then she was arrested. And I don't think she was ever convicted. I don't think any NGO worker has actually ever been convicted, but many people have been taken to court for all like human trafficking crimes, all of those kind of things. So you do have to wait for port to safety. It is super frustrating, and it can take anywhere from a day to, weeks. So we were really, really lucky that I think it was 4 days, maybe, which isn't a long time when you're sleeping and you're on land, but when you're responsible for 400 people and you're feeding them rice and beans and trying to look after their every need, it is a really long time, 4 days. But we were lucky because like I said, some of my colleagues were on for weeks waiting. It's the unknown.
Wow. So I'm guessing you're having to, when you're packing up the ship to go out, you're having to put on, 6 weeks of supplies and
yeah. So the kind of, I should know what the name of the boat, but the like basement of the boat, that's not the technical phrase.
Gonna get lots of written complaints about
the deep part of the boat. We spent the first few days just loading and loading, and I can't remember how many tons of rice and beans we would have put into that ship, but in theory we would have enough to feed 400 guests for like 2 months. And if we needed some, we do have other boats that could bring out supplies if we needed to. So yeah, you do have to prepare to be on the boat for a long time, and particularly during COVID when there was 2-week isolation at ports, you knew you were going to be on there for a really long time. But yeah, back in the day it would be like 2-week mission, because you'd go out, do your rescues, go straight to a port because there wouldn't be any backlash, and then that would be fine. But now, because there's so many political standoffs, you do have to prepare for being potentially at like months and months, which is, difficult.
And you mentioned about the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. Your husband did tell me about some challenging situations with them. Is there anything you'd like to say about that
I need to
experience?
fix my lawyer. So I will state the facts. The Libyan Coast Guard, and I say so-called Libyan Coast Guard because a Coast Guard is there to protect lives and, do a role. And I personally don't believe that the Libyan Coast Guard does coast guarding. And the entirety of the Sea Watch organization would agree with that. But they are funded by Frontex, if you're aware of them. They're the same organization that do the security at places like in Calais and the jungle and stuff, the same people that cut up tents with refugees sleeping inside, things like that. So it's an EU-funded operation. So the Frontex give the money to protect the European border. And it's supposed to, all the Schengen associated countries, they're supposed to be managing the external borders. And so they give them, you can read lots of different values, but 60 to 700 million pounds has been given by the EU to protect the waters. And there is a rule that you cannot return a person to a country where there is a serious risk of torture, inhumane conditions, persecution, threat to life. So by definition, Libya is not a safe country because people there are at risk of persecution, torture, threat to life. That is accepted and understood by European Union parties. Everyone understands that. And yet they pay and train the Libyan Coast Guard to push back illegally these boats back to Libya. So the same people that are taking thousands and thousands of dollars from the refugees, putting them on boats, are the same people that are working for the so-called Libyan Coast Guard to then push them back to Libya and to then put them in detention centres there. And that is completely so it's called the non-refoulement principle, and it's completely in breach of that. It's in breach of international law. It's against the Geneva Convention for Refugees. It's against everything, and yet it continues. So a huge part of what Sea Watch does isn't just the actual civilian sea rescue, but it's about the advocacy and the documentation of breaching this law. So Sea-Watch is not just made up of boats, but it's also got two, what are they called? Well, they're called aeroplanes in my world. There's a proper term for them, sea crafts maybe. And they're these planes that fly up. They have no capacity to do the rescues themselves because they're just small airplanes, but they will go up and they'll fly for 20 hours a day. They'll patrol the waters, and when they see this happening, they take photos, and it is awful. Having met many of the people that have done it, it's awful. They sit there and they have to watch this happen. And I would recommend anyone go to Sea-Watch's Instagram and watch some of the videos to see it for themselves. But you will see the so-called Libyan Coast Guard shooting at these inflatable boats and, causing distress, pushing them back, knocking them out of the boat, and then taking them back to Libya, which, that is illegal. And yeah, it's a horrible, horrible thing for them to see, but it's really important they document that. And they often, try and take Frontex and the EU funded operations to court over breach of international law. I mean, I've not seen anything come about that with them being successful, but sort of just keeping it in the media and documenting that. So that's a big part of what they do. But yeah, you look anywhere on their YouTube or Instagram, you can see regular videos of them doing that. So yeah, pretty awful.
And again, it's sort of like creating an industry out of this, isn't it?
Yeah, they have no incentive to stop the movement of people because it's so lucrative. I don't know how much the Libyan, GDP or whatever has gone up because of migration, but they really, take advantage.
To what extent is the experience of refugees you supported reflected in the UK media?
It's hard to know if I'm just super biased now because I've been exposed and I've met these people, and I spent weeks and weeks on board a ship with them. They are my friends. I know them. I cannot, in my opinion, they're completely dehumanized in the media, and it's very, very right wing. Everything that I seem to see online about them is, they're not fairly reflected at all. And I think that time, I can't remember when it was, a couple of years ago, when probably the Daily Mail did an article, 950 drown like rats in a cage. And the way they write about the loss of life in the Mediterranean Sea it's making a spectacle of it, but it's not actually acknowledging that that's 950 daughters, sons, wives, husbands, grandparents, children. They're actually people who actually have lives and dreams and ambitions. And yeah, I can't bear it, to be honest. I've never been able to bear it, but since this experience, I have a complete zero tolerance to any of that. So yeah, I find it really hard to read about it in the media. And I don't think that there is a space I just don't feel like their stories are ever heard, really, which is, part of the reason I sort of agree to do stuff like this, because, maybe someone will listen to it and it might change the way they interpret something that they read or hear. But yeah, I feel very, very, very privileged that I got to go and I got to meet those people. They're real people. You hear their story. You have to hear just one story from one person, and then you think, okay, we need to solve this problem. People need to be able to find a port of safety. They need to be able to seek refuge somewhere. And we cannot allow people to cross the Mediterranean Sea in these unseaworthy boats. It's crazy, but it's not new. I don't know if you remember that horrible photo in 2015 of that Syrian boy, the 3-year-old Alan Kurdi. I remember that so clearly, seeing that picture of him washing up on the shore and thinking, oh my God, this has to change. And that's 9 years ago. And even last week, there was a drowning in the Channel. And all the newspapers write about is the political difficulties between France and the UK, not these were the people, this is what, nothing about that. It's all just political points. And the only time that politicians talk about it is if they're then trying to score points either left or right. So yes, I don't think it's reported on at all. And if it is, it's sensationalized and it's in a completely dehuman way.
Have you done any further sort of voluntary work at all?
I've done bits and bobs within kind of where I live. So I work with the local homeless charity that has like a side arm that does like the resettlement scheme. So when the
Yeah.
Ukraine and Russian war begun, there was a lot of families that were sent to our area. So I kind of befriended a mum and her two kids and took them trampolining, took them to the shops, that kind of thing. And then I ran a swim group for Muslim women to allow them to kind of exercise without any men being at the swimming pool, which sounds like such a minor thing, but it was a huge thing. But it's very difficult to balance career progression, relationship, marriage, and being away all the time. So it's sort of taken a bit of a back burner in a way. So I've definitely carried on doing advocacy because actually that I can do from my living room at home. And I have done lots of talks and tried to kind of speak about the organisation and share the stories that were shared with me with their permission. And actually, I'm starting with an organisation called Medical Justice, if you've ever heard of them.
Mm.
So they are the only charity in the UK that go into the detention centres and write medical legal reports for people who have been detained and are seeking asylum. So it's a medical report that will go along with their asylum case to hopefully allow them to claim their appropriate asylum. So using that and trying to incorporate that as well with trying to train and kind of get to the next level as a doctor. So it is a difficult balance. I would love to do more, but the timing's got to be right, really. So I'm hoping that once I can get a bit further in my training, I'll maybe take a bit of time out of training and do a few more projects.
I'm thinking particularly about the experience in Greece and then the experience in the Med. What has it did it change you in any particular way? Firstly, obviously from a personal level, your perspectives changed and maybe your perspectives changed from doing all of that. But did it make you a better doctor when you came back to the UK?
I think I think at first it made me a worse doctor.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Well,
Because I found myself being quite impatient and frustrated at my patients in a way. So I was working back in A&E and seeing people who have absolutely nothing just kind of crack on with things, not ask for anything, be so grateful for the things they got, and then coming back to quite an affluent area of the country. I'm hoping that patients can tell, but I do remember being like 3 or 4 weeks back home thinking, oh God, I'm quite angry all the time. And then you have, as part of the like Sea Watch debrief, is you have a chat with one of the psychologists afterwards just to go through some of the things that happened and talk through. And it was actually only 4 weeks after. I was fine during the debrief, I was fine after. And then maybe 4 weeks after, it really hit me, the things that I saw and the things I heard. And then I was like, oh, okay, I just need to take a little bit of space from work, full stop. So just had like a few days off because again, I was locuming ad hoc bank work. So I just didn't pick up shifts for a week and then sort of reflected on my time. And then now, it's been a few years that I'm back. I think it definitely has made me a better doctor. I always get kind of comments that I'm very relaxed. And in my head, I'm like, yeah, well, you try being a doctor on board a ship in the middle of the Med and you would be relaxed in a well-staffed hospital. So I think it has made me definitely more empathetic. I definitely am more relaxed and I enjoy work a lot more because, yeah, I know what it can give someone and it is a privilege being a doctor. I felt very grateful to be a doctor when I got back. Some of the people that we was like dealing with on the boat had actually never, ever seen a doctor in their lives. And it's crazy how much we take that for granted in this country. Like the simple thing of just I know it's really hard to speak to a GP and I know the hospitals are busy, but you can see a doctor and you will see a doctor multiple times before the age of 5, whereas these people had just never, ever, ever, ever. So that's crazy, really. Amazing experience to be the first kind of doctor that they'd ever come across and to just treat them with kindness and dignity. Like that was a really amazing privilege to be able to do that, actually. If you read the BBC and the Daily Mail your whole life, then you will never get a balanced view. You just won't. So I think when you see something, an article, try and look at alternative sources. And I think the NGOs working in the ground are pretty unbiased about it. They're just giving you the facts as they see them. So yeah, that would that's where I get my information from. From Sea-Watch. But yeah, I can write a list. I mean, anything like Amnesty International, all of those kind of organizations working in human rights and migration, things like that. But yeah, I can give you a list. I do want to add, I think that everybody should read a poem by Warsan Shire. I don't know if you've ever come across this poem. So she is a lady born in Kenya. She's British Somali heritage, raised in the UK, who's done loads and loads of work with refugees and kind of spends time with them, hears their story, and then writes really amazing poems about their experience. And I don't know if you've ever heard the quote, whether I'm in an echo chamber, but you have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Have you come across that before? Mm. So that's from her poem, and it's a really, really long poem, and it's like, yeah, I find it very emotional, but that's obviously based on my experience. But she writes so beautifully about why people flee their homes and why people are refugees. Like, nobody wakes up and decides they want to be that. There is a reason these people are on the journey they're on. And she writes a really beautiful poem about it that is much more articulate than me, and it really summarizes and shares the experience of refugees. And I think it's really nice, and I think people should read that. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbours running faster than you. Breath bloody in their throats, the boy you went to school with, who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory, is holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one leaves home unless home chases you, fire under feet, hot blood in your belly. It's not something you ever thought of doing until the blade burnt threats into your neck. And even then you carried the anthem under your breath, only tearing up your passport in an airport toilet, sobbing as each mouthful of paper made it clear that you won't be going back. You have to understand that no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land.
My thanks to Sam for agreeing to be interviewed for this podcast. Thank you for your insight and all the work you do, both within the NHS and in all the voluntary work you do too. Shout out to the lawyer husband mentioned in the episode, Alex, through whom I've got to know Sam. The title track for this show is Young Shall Grow. Credit and thanks to Afro Cluster, Magugu and Asher Jane. This is a Be The Change Media Network production. My thanks to Lily Mott for your support and encouragement in helping edit this episode. And many thanks to you, listener, for lending me your ears. Make sure you subscribe to Be The Change podcast and all the different series that run from it. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.